In the group stages of EuroBasket 2025, GB put on an inspired performance, securing a win over Montenegro and breaking a 12-year drought of consecutive losses at the tournament. But overall, GB went just 1-4, including the worst recorded loss to Germany, where they lost by 63 points, with a final score of 120 to 57. The last time that happened, it was 1969, and a man had just landed on the moon. That loss included a depressing 30-9 third quarter. After the game, GB head coach Mark Stoutel said this.
I am a believer in British basketball, as are many people, but we definitely need wholesale improvements across every level of basketball in the UK.
With that in mind, it feels right to revisit why is Britain so bad at basketball.
What do you think when Britain gets brought up? Maybe you think of the Premier League or the drill music or getting your phone snatched in the middle of daylight by people on their scooters, but whatever you think about, it's not going to be basketball that you think about. What's surprising though is just how bad Britain is in basketball, because for a country with their resources and their size, they are horrible. I mean, you can look at the FIBA basketball rankings where they're ranked 49th in the world.
Actually, we're 48th now.
Great success.
Ranked behind countries like Angola, Jordan, and Cape Verde. I mean, really dude, behind Cape Verde, a tiny island country with a population of not even 600,000, has a better basketball team than Britain? It gets worse though when you compare Britain to their neighbor countries like France, Spain, and Germany. Every one of them are in the top 6, regularly compete for medals in the Olympics, and produce quality NBA players, whereas Britain is in the gutters. Now, people from Britain might rebuttal by saying, we don't care about basketball, we only care about footy. And that's why they're bad, but while this is somewhat true, it's mostly wrong. Let me explain. Yes, obviously football is king in Britain, but in terms of the second biggest sport that is played by young people, it's actually basketball, not rugby or cricket. There's this survey by Active Life Survey that says more than 1 million British people aged 18 to 34 play basketball. And when you look at the league pass numbers, UK is 9th in the world and number 1 in Europe in terms of the subscribers. And an internal survey by the NBA found UK has Europe's largest online fan community. So the interest is there, just not the talent. Also, the argument that because they are a football country means they can't play basketball doesn't work, because every Britain neighbor I mentioned, France, Spain, Germany, are also football countries and actually have had more success, They actually won trophies in the Euros and World Cups, while England has been on some Tottenham timing for the past 60 years. But having said all that, these countries have been able to have success in football and basketball, so it's not a mutually exclusive thing. We can ask the question, well, maybe it's the demographics. British people are just naturally bad at basketball, and that doesn't make sense because when you think about which demographic succeeds in the NBA, and it's usually people of African origins, right? And Britain doesn't lack that. It probably has the most out of any of these countries, and definitely way more than Spain and Germany. Then you take a look at the cultures, and Britain is definitely the country that is most similar to America out of these countries, with English being a crucial reason why. Then if there's interests, similar cultures, and favorable demographics, why is Britain so bad compared to these other countries? Well, it's gotta be a developmental thing, because you take a look at these other countries and they've been able to produce quality players. You take a look at France, who've had Tony Parker, Nicolas Batum, and Evan Fournier, and now with the new generation coming through of Wembanyama and the 2 top picks in the previous draft, Risa Shear and Sarr, and then you got Spain with the Gasol brothers, Ricky Rubio and Jose Calderon, and then you got Germany with Dirk back in the day, with Schroeder and Wagner brothers nowadays, while the best player ever Britain has ever produced is Luol Deng, who was a great player.
Wow, Luol Deng wasn't just a great player, he's a national treasure and an icon. He was a McDonald's All-American, Duke alumni, 7th overall pick, and a 2-time All-Star in a 15-year NBA career. Not to mention he was the NBA Live cover in 09 and 10 here in the UK. He was the only and the best player to step up for us and held the torch during the 2012 London Olympics.
But after that, it's not great. You got Michael Olowokandi, a 1st overall pick bust. And then you get the Joel Freelands of the world. And right now, they got Jeremy Sochan playing in the league, who's a young player with potential, but he doesn't even play for the national team because he was born to an American dad and Polish mom in America and raised in England, but couldn't participate for the national team because he couldn't get a passport, which made him declare for the Polish national team instead of the English team.
Hold on a sec. While it's true that Jeremy Sohan plays for Poland and not for GB, let's not pretend like his development didn't happen while he was at Itchen College and with the Solent Kestrels. And while we're at it, he definitely hasn't given up on British basketball. Recently, he was appointed as part of the London Task Force by the Mayor Sadiq Khan to try and understand and think about ways that basketball could be improved in Britain.
Then we get the question, if it's a developmental issue, why is Britain so bad at developing their players? To answer that question, we need to go back to the heyday of basketball in Britain in the 90s, back when basketball was on mainstream TV in Britain. And the BBL, no, not that BBL, but the British Basketball League was thriving and reached their peak in 1999 in their title decider game in Manchester between the Manchester Giants and the Sheffield Sharks. The Giants were led by future title-winning head coach Nick Nurse, while the Sharks were being coached by the current head coach of the Timberwolves, Chris Finch. This was the season big sponsors came in to support the league. Budweiser got the naming rights this year, and companies like Playboy and Peugeot also became sponsors, and for a good reason. There was a feeling that heading into the 2000s, basketball would only continue to grow in the United Kingdom. The game between the Giants and the Sharks would be attended by 11,000 people and would be a very exciting game as the Sharks would beat the Giants and clinch the title on a game-winning jumper, which would wrap up a very successful season for the league. With the growing momentum of British basketball, a new televisor called the NTL would outbid Sky with a 10-year 22 million quid contract. And unfortunately, this right here would be the downfall of the BBL, because within 2 years of this contract, NTL would file for bankruptcy, to which then ITV Digital would pick up the contract. But then they themselves would go under 18 months later, which meant that the BBL would be without most of the 22 million quid and the exposure in television, which disrupted the momentum the league had going. Ever since then, BBL had fumbled a lot of the interest it would have otherwise had if the televisors didn't go bankrupt or they stuck with Sky. And nowadays, they're back in Sky, just not on the primetime channels anymore.
British basketball isn't on Sky anymore. For the last year, everything's been free and easy to stream over on DAZN.
And to demonstrate just how much value it diminished, remember how the league was offered 22 million quid for the broadcasting rights back in the 90s? Well, just recently, an American fund 777 bought a 45% stake in the BBL just for 7 million quid, which is a big contrast from the 22 million offered just for broadcasting rights. The wildest thing is, the BBL would have trouble receiving this 7 million quid from 777 because, according to emails between the head of BBL and 777, he revealed that the league would be put into immediate administration unless the delayed payment of £825,000 was received from 777. That's where the league is at now, struggling in exposure and in turn money, especially compared to the EuroLeague. That means that the country's main basketball league doesn't have enough resources to adequately attract and develop homegrown talent, that is, if the talent doesn't go elsewhere in Europe or decide to play a different sport, because a mid-tier player at a top team like the Lions or the Newcastle Eagles earns £3,000 to £4,000, which is less than every player in the championship.
Well, that's not quite how it turned out. In the end, 777 collapsed and threatened to bring down the entire scene of UK basketball. They were stripped by the British Basketball Federation, the BBF, of their licence and could no longer operate as a league. It was at that point that the franchise owners stepped up and decided that they would own and operate their own league, rebranding as Super League Basketball. And in a whirlwind 3 months, we went from absolutely no idea if there was going to be a professional league to a fully functioning 9-team season. At the time, they were granted a 3-year interim licence, and it seemed only logical that this would be extended and the sport would grow. But that was wrong. Instead, British Basketball Federation put out a tender for the licence to run British basketball and charged people $25,000 for the pleasure of applying. Immediately, the SLB owners refused, and that led to the BBF giving a preferred bidder status to a group led by Marshall Glickman, former president of the Portland Trail Blazers and former interim CEO of the EuroLeague. The SLB clubs have no interest of being part of Glickman's new Great British Basketball League and have refused any conversations about joining it, despite allegedly Glickman targeting some of the owners with our financial incentives to be the first team to break ranks. The groups have now been warring for over 7 months in the public and in the press, and through our legal systems. Super League Basketball has an ongoing legal case against the BBF, and BBF has a countersuit right back. Most notably, the BBF was refusing to endorse foreign players this summer, threatening the SLB's ability to bring in high-level talent. That is, until the Home Office had to intervene and told the BBF they were wrong. Really, British basketball landscape's a little bit of a mess right now.
If the BBL can't afford to develop British talent, then what about the government? Well, it doesn't get better there because basketball is very underfunded compared to sports that are a lot less popular and less played than basketball. For example, UK Sport, which is the body that funds Great Britain's Olympic teams, gave basketball 8 million quid in the 2012 Olympics, while 27 million went to the rowing team, 23 million to sailing, and 13 million to the equestrian team. Despite the underfunding, they outperformed compared to expectations that tournament because they would almost beat the eventual silver medalist Spain as they only lost by 1 point. Despite the overperformance, UK Sport would completely cut the basketball funding after the tournament. That's right, from then on, their national teams would receive 0 in funding, which is problematic on many levels. Why did they do this? You got to understand, UK Sport only cares about prestige and how likely their team is to win a medal, meaning they don't care if a sport is significant or influential, unless it's football, rugby, or cricket. And they would rather invest their money into niche, prestigious sports that are played by the elites than inject money into basketball to try and compete with other top teams. That's why teams like canoeing, curling, and netball receives tons of funding while basketball receives nothing. I mean, come on dude, netball really do a knockoff of basketball receives more funding? That's crazy. You might think, well, what's the big deal about the national team not getting funding? What does it have to do with development? Because most of the players in the national team should have resources to develop by themselves, right? I can tell you how the lack of funding is problematic by telling this one anecdote told by a coach who coached a kid who was called up by the England under-18 side. However, since there was no funding for the national team, his parents would have to cover the cost of travel, which they couldn't afford whatever thousands of quid needed to travel across Europe to play for the team. The team would organize a fundraiser to get him on the flight and participate, but the damning thing was, around this time, a student in the same class as this kid would get called up for the rugby under-18 team and he would get everything taken care of, driven to Heathrow, flown to Italy, and taken care of every expense. That right there is a problem because majority of the people who play basketball are working class people. Whether you are a minority working class person from London or a white working class person from the north, at the end of the day, basketball is a working class sport, and most parents can't afford the expenses needed to support their kids into growing as players when the top league or the government can't even provide infrastructure to grow their players. This means that most players who have potential in basketball usually end up playing football because that's the most accessible sport regardless of what resources you have. There's this damning number that calculated how much UK Sport gave between 2013 and 2017 based on each civilian participant, and it calculated basketball received 9.25 quid, while cricket received 70.72 quid, and rugby almost 60 quid. So it's not crazy that their teams are a lot less competitive than their cricket or rugby teams, and because their basketball teams have no chance of medals, that means that they don't want to put any more capital into it, which creates a cycle of them being terrible while nothing is being done to improve it. Without the investment and infrastructure, it's really tough for the people who do play basketball to pursue it seriously. That means that unless something changes with the league or the government, it would be really difficult for them to compete with top countries even though they have the interest, culture, and demographic to be competitive. Anyhow, that's what I have to say about basketball in Britain, and if you guys have opinions about this, write a comment about what you think.